I remember the exact morning it hit me. Not like a wave, not like some dramatic moment you'd see in a movie. It was quieter than that. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, the same cup I'd had every morning for the past 40 years, and I just sat there. The house was completely still. No alarm had gone off. No one needed anything from me. The coffee was getting cold, and I hadn't even taken a sip yet, because I was just sitting there staring at the wall. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, I realized I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. Not just that morning. I mean in general. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next with my life. And that scared me more than anything I had ever faced in all my years of working, raising kids, paying bills, dealing with bosses, dealing with bad years and tight budgets and everything else that comes with a life fully lived. None of that had ever made me feel the way that quiet kitchen made me feel that morning. It made me feel like I had somehow become invisible, like the world had just kept moving, and I had stayed behind without anybody telling me that was going to happen. I was 67 years old. I had worked for over 4 decades. I had done everything they told you to do. I saved. I showed up. I provided. And now I was sitting in a kitchen that smelled like old coffee, and I had nowhere to be and nobody waiting on me, and I didn't know if that was supposed to feel like freedom or something else entirely. It felt like something else entirely. I want to tell you my story because I think a lot of men my age, men who gave everything they had to their work and their families, men who spent decades being needed and useful and present, I think a lot of us arrived at retirement and found something waiting for us that nobody ever mentioned. Nobody warned us, not our fathers, not our friends, not the financial planners who helped us figure out our 401k. Nobody sat us down and said, hey, when it's all over, when the career ends and the kids are gone and the house gets quiet, there's going to be a moment where you have to figure out who you actually are without all of it. And that moment is harder than anything else you've ever done. This is my story. I hope some part of it sounds familiar to you. I started working when I was 16 years old. My first job was bagging groceries at a ShopRite about 3 miles from the house I grew up in. Out in central New Jersey, a quiet suburb where everybody knew everybody and the summers smelled like cut grass and charcoal from somebody's backyard grill. I worked that job after school and on weekends, and I handed most of what I made to my mother because my father had been laid off that year, and things were tight in a way that we didn't talk about out loud, but everybody in the house understood. That was just how it was. You worked, you contributed. You didn't complain about it because complaining didn't put food on the table. That was the first real lesson my life taught me, and it stuck with me for the next 50 years in ways I didn't fully understand until I was sitting in that quiet kitchen with cold coffee and nowhere to be. I carried that lesson into every job I ever had. You show up. You do the work. You don't make a fuss. By the time I was 22, I had finished 2 years at a community college and gotten myself hired on at a mid-sized manufacturing company outside of Trenton. Nothing glamorous. We made parts, industrial components that went into equipment that went into factories and warehouses all over the country. I started on the floor doing quality checks, and within a few years I had moved into a supervisory role and then eventually into plant operations management. It wasn't the career I had dreamed about when I was a kid, but I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure I ever had a clear dream about a career. I had dreams about stability, about not having to worry the way my parents worried, about being the kind of man who could look his family in the eye and say, we're going to be okay, and actually mean it. That's what I wanted. And that job gave me a path toward it, so I held on to that path with both hands for a very long time. By the time I was in my early 30s, I had married my wife Carol. We had bought a house in a neighborhood outside of Flemington with a decent yard and good schools. And we had 2 kids, our son David and our daughter Michelle. Life was full in those years. I mean genuinely full. Full in the way that leaves you exhausted at the end of every day, but also keeps you from thinking too hard about anything beyond the immediate next thing you have to do. There was always a next thing. Always the mortgage payment, the car that needed new tires, David's Little League on Saturday mornings, Michelle's school play that I almost missed because I had to work late, and I drove 40 minutes in the dark to get there just in time to see the last 20 minutes of it. Carol managing the house and working part-time at the pediatrician's office down the road. Dinner on the table at 6:30 most nights, or close to it. Weekends spent doing yard work and grocery runs and fixing things around the house that I kept putting off until they became impossible to ignore any longer. That was my life to my 30s and into my 40s, and it was a good life. I want to be clear about that because what I'm going to tell you later might make it sound like I'm complaining, and I'm not. I'm really not. I loved my family. I loved coming home to that house. I loved the sound of the kids running around on a Saturday afternoon and the smell of Carol's cooking and the way the neighborhood felt on summer evenings when everyone was outside and the fireflies were starting to come out. I loved all of it, but the truth is I also loved my work, and I think that's where things got complicated in ways I didn't see until much later. I loved the structure of it. I loved walking into that plant every morning and knowing exactly what my role was. I was the guy who kept things running. I was the guy people came to when something went sideways and they needed it fixed. I was the guy who knew the machines and knew the schedules and knew which vendors to call and how to talk to the guys on the floor when morale was low and how to manage up when the executives were breathing down our necks about production numbers. I was competent, deeply, genuinely competent at what I did, and there is a quiet satisfaction in that kind of competence that I don't think gets talked about enough. It's not about ego. It's not about wanting to be the big shot. It's about walking into a building every day and knowing that your presence there matters, knowing that things would be different, noticeably different, if you weren't there. That feeling becomes a part of you over 40 years. It becomes so woven into who you are that you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic if you live near a highway long enough. It's just there. It's just part of the background of your life. And you have absolutely no idea what it's going to feel like when it stops. I worked at that company for 31 years. 31 years in the same building, walking the same floors, parking in the same spot in the lot, drinking bad coffee out of the same break room machine that was always either too hot or barely warm and never quite right, but you drank it anyway because that's what you did. I knew every crack in the ceiling of my office. I knew which fluorescent light above the south hallway flickered on cold mornings and had been flickering for 15 years because nobody ever bothered to replace it. I knew the names of everybody's kids and grandkids. I knew which guys were having a rough year at home and which ones were doing all right. That place was as much a part of my daily life as my own house was. Maybe more, honestly, because I spent more waking hours there than anywhere else. And when I finally retired at 65 after a short ceremony in the conference room with sheet cake from the grocery store and handshakes and a card that everyone had signed, I walked out of that building for the last time and I told myself I was ready. I told myself I had earned this. I told myself that everything I had worked for my whole life was finally about to pay off in the form of free time and rest and doing whatever I wanted. I believed that completely. I had no reason not to. I had been thinking about retirement for years before it actually happened. I think most men who work as long as I did spend a good portion of their later career years building up this idea in their heads of what retirement is going to look like. It becomes almost like a destination you're driving toward on a long road trip. You've been in the car for hours. Your back hurts. The radio has been playing the same handful of songs on repeat. And somewhere up ahead there's a place where you're going to stop and stretch your legs and breathe some fresh air and finally just relax. That's how I thought about it. That's the picture I'd carried around in my head for probably the last decade of my working life. And the picture was genuinely appealing. I wasn't dreaming about anything extravagant. I wasn't fantasizing about cruises to the Mediterranean or a second home somewhere warm. Though Carol and I did talk sometimes about spending winters in Florida once we were both retired, mostly what I imagined was simpler than any of that. I imagined mornings without alarm clocks. I imagined having time to actually sit with my coffee instead of drinking it, standing over the kitchen sink while I checked my phone for work emails before I'd even gotten fully dressed. I imagined being able to take a walk in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon just because I felt like it. I imagined having time to finally read the books that had been sitting on my nightstand for years, the ones I kept meaning to get to, but never did because by the time I got into bed at night, I was too tired to read more than a page or two before my eyes gave out on me. I imagined weekends that didn't feel like recovery periods before the next week started all over again. I imagined having the time and the mental space to actually be present with Carol in a way that the years of work had made difficult. She had always been patient with me about that, patient in the way that good spouses are, where they understand the demands of the life you built together, even when those demands take something away from them. I knew she had given up a lot over the years. Social plans that got canceled because I had to work late. Vacations that got cut short because something came up at the plant. Evenings where I came home so worn down that I was barely there even when I was sitting right next to her on the couch. I had told myself that retirement was going to be my chance to make some of that up to her. To actually be her husband, in the full sense of the word, not just the man who paid the bills and showed up at holidays and fell asleep in the recliner by 9 o'clock on a Friday night. I had plans. Not big, elaborate plans, but real ones. I was going to get back into woodworking. I had a workbench in the garage that I'd set up years ago with good intentions, and then never really used because there was never enough time. I had some basic tools. I figured I'd learn more as I went, maybe take a class at the community center, or just watch videos online and teach myself. I liked the idea of making things with my hands. Things that were real and solid and that you could look at when they were done and say, I made that. After 31 years of managing processes and spreadsheets and personnel issues, the idea of making something you could actually touch felt deeply satisfying in a way I could feel in my chest when I thought about it. I also told myself I was going to get my health back in order. I put on weight over the years the way most men do, gradually and without noticing, until suddenly your pants don't fit the way they used to, and you're a little winded, climbing a flight of stairs. Nothing serious, but enough that my doctor had been nudging me about it for a while. I figured retirement would give me the time to walk every day, maybe get a gym membership, eat better because I wouldn't be grabbing fast food on the way back from a late meeting or stress eating from the vending machine in the break room. I was genuinely optimistic about all of this. When people at work asked me in those last few months what I was going to do in retirement, I had a ready answer. I'd tell them about the woodworking and the walking and the time with Carol and maybe a road trip or two, and they'd smile and nod and say that sounded great, that sounded like exactly the right way to do it. And I believed them. I believed all of it. The retirement party came and went. Carol and the kids took me out to a nice dinner the following weekend. David drove up from Philadelphia, and Michelle came with her husband and the grandkids, and we had a good meal, and I felt genuinely happy that night. Genuinely at ease in a way I hadn't felt in years. The next Monday morning, I woke up without an alarm for the first time in over 4 decades of working life, and I lay there in bed, listening to the neighborhood come alive outside the window. A garbage truck somewhere down the street. A dog barking. The sound of a car backing out of a driveway. And I thought, this is it. This is the beginning of the rest of it. This is what I worked for. And for the first few weeks, if I'm being completely truthful, it actually felt pretty good. Not great. Not the revelation I had maybe secretly hoped for. But good. There was a genuine pleasure in those first slow mornings. In making a real breakfast instead of grabbing something on the run. In sitting outside on the back porch with my coffee and watching the birds at the feeder Carol had hung from the oak tree near the fence. In taking a long walk around the neighborhood in the middle of a Wednesday morning when everyone else was at work and the streets were quiet and the air smelled like early autumn, and I thought, okay, I can do this. This is going to be fine. But fine is a funny word. Fine covers a lot of ground. And somewhere underneath the fine, something else was already beginning to stir. Something I didn't have a name for yet. Something quiet and patient that was willing to wait until the novelty wore off before it made itself fully known to me. And the novelty wore off faster than I expected. It started with the mornings. Not dramatically. Not in any way that you could point to and say, there, that's the moment things changed. It was more like a slow dimming. The first few weeks of retirement, the mornings had felt like a gift. Waking up without an alarm, moving at my own pace, having that extra cup of coffee without watching the clock. But somewhere around the 6th or 7th week, something shifted in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. The mornings started to feel long in a way they hadn't before. Not restful. Long. I'd wake up around 6:30 out of pure habit, my body still running on the same internal clock it had kept for 40 years, and I'd lie there in the dark for a while, listening to Carol breathe beside me and staring up at the ceiling and staring up at the ceiling and thinking, okay, what's today? And the answer was always the same: nothing. Nothing specific, nothing that required me to be anywhere or do anything or talk to anybody by a certain time. And in the beginning, that had felt like freedom, but somewhere around week 6 or 7, it started to feel like something else that I didn't want to name yet. I'd get up and make the coffee and stand at the kitchen window and watch the neighbors leaving for work. I watched them in a way I never had before, because I had never been home to see it. The guy across the street, Tom, he left every morning at 7:15 sharp, backing his Silverado out of the driveway with his travel mug on the roof until he remembered it at the end of the block, same as always. The young woman 2 doors down, who I barely knew, she left around 7:30 in her scrubs, probably a nurse or a technician of some kind, always walking fast, always looking a little rushed, her hair still a little damp. The retired couple at the end of the block, the Hendersons, they walked their dog every morning around 8. I started to time my second cup of coffee to when they passed the front of my house so I'd have something to watch. That's not something I would have admitted to anyone at the time, but it's true. By week 8, I had started to notice that the woodworking bench in the garage wasn't getting used the way I had planned. I'd go out there and stand in front of it and pick up a piece of wood and look at it, and then put it back down and come inside. It wasn't laziness exactly, it was more like I couldn't locate the motivation to start. Starting felt like it required a kind of energy that wasn't quite available to me in those slow, formless mornings. I told myself I'd get to it. I told myself I just needed to settle in a little more, find my rhythm, give it time. The walks I had planned to take every day were happening maybe 3 times a week, sometimes less. And even on the days I did walk, I find myself back home within 40 minutes, standing in the driveway, not quite ready to go inside, but not sure what else to do either. The neighborhood was quiet during the day in a way I had never experienced before, because I had never been home during the day before. Quiet in a way that pressed in on you a little if you let it. The phone wasn't ringing the way it used to. That was another thing I noticed around that time. When I was working, my phone had been an almost constant presence. Texts, emails, calls from the plant, calls from vendors, calls from the guys on my team. Even on weekends, it had buzzed and chimed with enough regularity that I had sometimes fantasized about turning it off entirely and just disappearing for a day. Now, it sat on the kitchen counter, and it was quiet for hours at a stretch. Carol would call if she was out running errands and needed me to check if we were out of something. David texted maybe once or twice a week, usually something casual, a funny video or a quick check-in. Michelle called on Sundays. That was about it. And I understood that. I understood that my kids had their own lives, their own full and busy lives, and they weren't going to call their retired father every day just to fill his time. That would have been strange, and I wouldn't have wanted it. But understanding something and feeling something are 2 different things. And what I felt when I looked at that quiet phone was something I didn't examine too closely in those early weeks because I wasn't ready to examine it yet. I started watching more television than I ever had in my life. Not because there was anything I particularly wanted to watch, but because having the TV on made the house feel less quiet. I put on the news in the morning and then leave it running into the afternoon, not really watching it, just letting the voices fill the rooms while I moved around doing small things. Washing the breakfast dishes, folding laundry, straightening up the garage without actually working on anything. Carol noticed. She didn't say anything for a while, but I could tell she noticed. She had her own routines and her own social world, her book club, her friend Janet from church, who she had lunch with every couple of weeks, her garden that she tended to, with a patience and consistency that I had always quietly admired. She was managing the transition better than I was, and I think we both knew it, though neither of us said so out loud. There was one afternoon around the 2-month mark that I remember more clearly than most from that period. It was a Thursday. Carol was out somewhere, I don't remember where. I had eaten lunch alone, just a sandwich, standing at the counter the way I used to eat when I was in a hurry, even though I wasn't in a hurry at all, just out of habit. And after I put the plate in the sink, I stood in the middle of the kitchen, and the house was completely silent except for the refrigerator humming and some kind of bird outside the window. And I stood there for what felt like a long time, just standing there in the middle of my own kitchen on a Thursday afternoon with absolutely nowhere to be, and I felt something move through me that I can only describe as a kind of hollowness. Not sadness exactly, not yet, just hollowness. Like something that used to fill up a significant portion of my insides had quietly packed up and left without making a sound. I didn't tell anyone about that afternoon for a long time. I barely admitted it to myself. There was a specific day, about 4 months into retirement, when the thing I had been avoiding thinking about directly finally sat down across from me and refused to look away. I remember it was a Tuesday in late November. Carol had gone to her book club in the evening, and I was alone in the house. I had eaten dinner by myself, just reheated some leftover soup, and I was sitting in the living room with the television on and a book open in my lap that I hadn't read a single page of. The news was on. Some story about the economy, and I wasn't really watching it, just letting the light from the screen flicker across the room the way I'd gotten used to doing. And my phone buzzed on the side table, and I picked it up thinking maybe it was Carol or one of the kids, and it was an email, a forwarded message from someone in my old company. One of the younger managers I had worked with, a guy named Greg, who I had always liked. A sharp kid who had come up through the ranks and who I had mentored a little in his early years in the department. He had forwarded me the announcement of a new production initiative they were rolling out at the plant, some efficiency program that the new management had put together. He had written just 2 lines above the forwarded message. Thought you might find this interesting. Hope retirement is treating you well. That was it. That was the whole message. And I sat there reading those 2 lines and the forwarded announcement, and what I felt was not what I expected to feel. I had expected maybe a small pang of nostalgia, maybe a flicker of curiosity about what they were doing differently, the way you might feel seeing a photo of a place you used to live. Instead, what I felt was something much stranger and much harder to sit with. I read through the initiative they were describing, and I could see immediately, with the kind of clarity that only comes from 3 decades of experience in that specific building with those specific machines and those specific people, I could see 3 places where their approach was going to create problems. Significant problems, the kind that would cost them time and money, and probably some frustration on the floor before they figured it out. And my first instinct, the instinct that came before I had even finished reading, was to pick up the phone and call someone, to call Greg or call the plant manager or call somebody and say, "Hey, I see what you're trying to do here, and here's what you need to watch out for." That instinct was so strong and so immediate and so deeply familiar that it took me a moment to catch up to the reality of the situation, which was that nobody had asked me. Nobody had asked me anything. Greg had sent me that email the way you might send a retiree a postcard from the office. Just a friendly gesture, a way of saying we remember you exist. He wasn't asking for my input. He wasn't looking for my expertise. He was being kind. And the plant was going to roll out that initiative and hit those problems and work through them and figure it out. And they were going to do all of that entirely without me, because I no longer worked there, because my role there was finished, because whatever I knew and whatever I could see and whatever I might have contributed was no longer part of the equation. I put the phone down, and I sat with that for a long time. The news kept going on the television. Some anchor was talking about something, I couldn't tell you what. The room felt very still, and I started to think, really think, for maybe the first time since I had retired, about what it actually meant that my career was over. Not in the practical sense. I had understood the practical sense for years. I had the savings, I had the pension, I had Medicare, I had all the logistics sorted out. I'm talking about what it meant in a deeper sense, what it meant about who I was now. Because here's the thing that I had never said out loud to anyone and had barely allowed myself to think directly. For 40+ years, my sense of who I was had been almost entirely built around what I did, not in an arrogant way. Not in a way where I walked around thinking I was better than anybody, or that my job made me special. It was quieter than that, and more fundamental than that. It was simply that when I woke up every morning, I knew who I was because I knew what I was for. I was the plant operations manager. I was the guy who kept things running. I was the person that certain problems got brought to because I was the one who could solve them. That knowledge, that daily confirmation of my own usefulness and competence, had been so constant and so reliable for so long that I had stopped experiencing it as something separate from myself. It had just become me. The way your own heartbeat becomes something you stop hearing after a while, because it's always there. And now, it wasn't there. And in its absence, I was sitting in my living room on a Tuesday night in November, trying to figure out who exactly was sitting in that chair. Because the man I had understood myself to be for the better part of half a century, that man had a place he went every morning, and a role he filled, and people who depended on him, and problems that needed his specific mind and his specific experience. And now there was none of that. Now, there was just a 67-year-old man in a quiet house with a book he wasn't reading, and a television he wasn't watching, and an email from a former colleague that had been sent out of kindness and had landed like a very quiet gut punch. I sat there for a long time after that. Carol came home around 9:30 and she could tell something was off, and she asked me if I was all right, and I told her I was just tired, which was true in a way. I was tired. But not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. I was tired in a way that I was only just beginning to understand the full dimensions of. The realization that settled over me that night, slowly and without any drama, was this. I had spent my entire adult life being needed, being genuinely, practically, specifically needed. And that neededness had been the invisible architecture of my identity for so long that I had never once stopped to examine what was underneath it. What was left of me when you took away the role. What I actually was when I wasn't being useful to someone. And sitting there in that living room with the television flickering and the house quiet around me, I genuinely did not know the answer to that question. And that scared me in a way that was different from any fear I had felt before, because every other fear I could remember in my life had been about something external. Losing a job, not being able to pay the bills, something happening to Carol or the kids. Those were fears about things out in the world, things you could potentially do something about, problems you could work at and manage and hopefully solve. This fear was about something internal, something that lived right at the center of how I understood myself, and I had no idea at all how to even begin to work on it. I just sat there that night with the quiet of the house around me and the television, talking to nobody, and my untouched book in my lap, and I let the realization settle all the way down to the bottom of me. I was no longer needed. Not in the way I had been needed for 40 years, and I did not know who I was without that. The months that followed that November night were the hardest stretch of my retirement, and I say that knowing full well that from the outside nothing about my life looked particularly hard. I had my health, more or less. I had Carol. I had a paid-off house in a decent neighborhood and enough money coming in between the pension and Social Security to live comfortably without worry. I was aware of all of that. I counted those things and I told myself I had no right to feel the way I was feeling, which I now understand was exactly the wrong thing to tell myself. But at the time, it just added a layer of guilt on top of everything else. Because the feeling was there regardless of whether I thought I had earned the right to feel it. It was there every morning when I woke up and lay in the dim light of the bedroom, trying to locate a reason to get up that felt as solid and real as the reasons I used to have. It was there over breakfast when the kitchen felt too quiet and the day stretched out in front of me like an empty field with no path marked through it. It was there in the middle of the afternoon when I'd find myself standing in a room I had walked into without remembering why, not because my memory was failing me in any serious way, but because there was so little purpose driving my movement through the house that one room was essentially the same as any other. The days had a texture to them in that period that I struggle to describe accurately. They weren't painful exactly, not in the acute way that real grief or crisis is painful. They were more like a persistent dull pressure, a low-grade heaviness that sat behind everything I did and made even simple pleasures feel slightly muted. I'd pour a cup of coffee and stand at the kitchen window and the coffee would taste fine and the morning light coming through the glass would be genuinely pretty, and I'd think, this should feel nice. And it would feel okay, but okay and nice are not the same thing, and I knew the difference even if I couldn't explain it. I started paying very close attention to the clock in a way that felt almost obsessive. I checked the time constantly throughout the day, not because I had anywhere to be, but because the movement of time had become something I was acutely aware of in a way I never had been when I was working. When you're working, time moves in relation to things. You have a meeting at 10, lunch at noon, a call at 2, you need to get the report done before 4:30. Time has shape because your obligations give it shape. In retirement, at least in that period for me, time was shapeless. It was just a long, undifferentiated stretch of hours that moved at whatever pace they felt like moving, which was usually slow. Slow in the way that makes you hyper-aware of each individual minute, in a way that is not peaceful, but is actually its own kind of exhausting. I was sleeping too much and also sleeping badly, which sounds contradictory but is entirely possible, and I'm sure some of you listening to this know exactly what I mean. I'd fall asleep in the recliner in the early evening, sometimes before 7 o'clock, wake up stiff and disoriented at 9 or 10, drag myself to bed, and then lie there unable to fall back into a real sleep until 1 or 2 in the morning. I'd lie there in the dark next to Carol, listening to the house settle, listening to a car pass on the street outside occasionally, and my mind would do what minds do in the small hours of the morning, which is to say, it would find every unresolved thing and turn it over and over in the dark. I thought about getting older in those late nights in a way I never had before retirement. When you're working, you don't have time to think about aging in any sustained way. You notice it in passing, a new ache in the morning, a name that takes a second longer to come to you, reading glasses that you didn't need 10 years ago. But you file those things away and keep moving because you have things to do and places to be. In retirement, those observations had nowhere to be filed away to. They just sat there and accumulated. I noticed things about my body that I hadn't paid attention to before. The way my knees complained going down the stairs in the morning. The way certain foods that had never bothered me before now sat uncomfortably. The way my hands had started to look like my father's hands, which was not an unpleasant observation exactly, but it was a significant one. My father had died at 73. I was 67. That arithmetic was not lost on me in those quiet nighttime hours. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make it sound like I was in a clinical depression, though looking back, I wonder sometimes how close I was to that line without crossing it. What I was experiencing felt more like a prolonged identity dislocation, like the GPS of my life had lost its signal and was trying to recalculate, and in the meantime, I was just pulled over on the side of the road waiting. There was also the social dimension of it, which I hadn't anticipated at all. When you work for 30-some years in the same place with the same people, you develop relationships that feel solid and real, and they are real while they exist in that context. But what I discovered is that a lot of those relationships are more context-dependent than you realize. Greg sent me that one email. A few other former colleagues had sent notes when I first retired. The usual warm wishes, keep in touch, we'll grab lunch sometime. The lunch invitations never materialized into actual lunches. The keep in touches faded after a few exchanges. By the time I was 6 months into retirement, the people I had spent more waking hours with than almost anyone in my life had essentially receded into the past, not because anyone was unkind or had meant to disappear, but because that's how it works. You are connected to work people through work. When the work is gone, the connective tissue is gone with it, and you're left holding the memory of relationships that no longer have a container to exist in. That was lonelier than I expected. Not a dramatic loneliness. Not the kind that makes you reach for the phone and call someone at midnight. Just a steady, ambient loneliness that became part of the background of my days, the way the sound of the refrigerator becomes part of the background of your kitchen. You stop noticing it directly, but it's always there. Carol did her best. I want to make sure I say that clearly because she was patient with me in ways she absolutely did not have to be. She didn't push me to talk about what I was feeling when I wasn't ready to. She kept the house feeling warm and normal, and she included me in her routines when she could without making me feel like a project she was managing. But there were moments, I could see it in her face sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, moments where she was worried about me in a way that she was trying not to show. And that worried me in its own right, the idea that my struggles were becoming something she had to carry. That was not what I had promised her retirement would look like. That was not the version of this I had sold either of us on. The hardest part of those months, the thing that was most difficult to sit with on a daily basis, was the feeling of irrelevance, not just in the work sense, in a broader sense. The feeling that the world was operating at full speed and I was watching it from behind glass. My grandkids were growing up, and their lives were full of things that had nothing to do with me. My kids were deep in the middle of their careers and their families and their own complicated lives. The neighborhood kept doing what neighborhoods do. The news kept happening. Things kept moving and changing and developing, and none of it required anything from me. I had become, without anyone intending it, and without any malice from anyone, essentially optional. And optional is a very hard thing to be when your whole life you have been necessary. There is a particular kind of thinking that comes to you in retirement that doesn't really have access to you when you're still working. Because when you're working, you're always moving forward, and forward momentum has a way of keeping certain thoughts at a comfortable distance behind you. But when the forward momentum stops, when the days slow down and the house gets quiet, and there's nothing urgent pulling your attention toward the future, those thoughts catch up to you. They walk right through the front door and sit down at your kitchen table, and they don't leave. I'm talking about regrets, not the dramatic kind that make for good movies, not the catastrophic choices or the roads famously not taken. I'm talking about the smaller, quieter regrets that accumulate over a lifetime of being a working man with a family and not enough hours in any given day. The ones that don't announce themselves as regrets while you're living through them, because at the time, they just look like necessary trade-offs, the unavoidable costs of a life being responsibly managed. It's only later, much later, sitting in the stillness of retirement, that you start to see them for what they were. The thing I kept coming back to, the one that sat heaviest, was time with my kids when they were young. I was there. I want to be clear about that. I was not an absent father in any dramatic sense. I came home every night. I showed up to the important things. I coached David's baseball team for 2 seasons when he was 9 and 10, which I loved and which I know he remembers. I was at Michelle's graduation, both of them. I was at the hospital when both grandkids were born. I did all the things a father is supposed to do in the broad accounting of it, but the broad accounting leaves out a lot. It leaves out the Tuesday nights when David wanted to show me something he had built with his Legos, and I told him in a few minutes, just let me finish reading this report, and a few minutes turned into bedtime and we never got back to the Legos. It leaves out the Saturday mornings when Michelle was maybe 11 or 12, and she was going through that phase where she wanted to talk, really talk, about things she was thinking about and figuring out, and I was out in the driveway washing the car or dealing with something around the house, and I half listened and nodded, but I wasn't really present the way she needed me to be, and I think some part of her knew it even then. It leaves out the vacations where I brought work with me, not physically. In those early years before everyone had a laptop and a smartphone, but mentally. I was at the beach with my family, and I was also running through production schedules in my head and composing emails I needed to send on Monday morning and working through whatever current crisis was occupying the plant that week. I was there and I wasn't there. That particular form of absence, the kind where your body is in the room but your mind is somewhere else entirely, is one I have thought about a great deal in retirement. Because it's invisible while it's happening, you don't feel like you're failing anyone. You feel like you're managing things. You feel like you're holding it all together. The job and the family and the house and the finances and the mental energy required to hold all of that together at once is genuinely enormous. And you tell yourself that the family understands, that they know you're doing it for them, that the providing is itself a form of love, even when it comes at the cost of presence. And they do understand. My kids understand that now as adults with their own careers and their own kids and their own impossible balancing acts. David has told me as much in his straightforward way. He doesn't hold it against me. Michelle is the same. They're good people, and they had a good childhood, and they know their father loved them. But understanding is different from not having lost anything. And I did lose things. We all lost things. Moments that don't come back. Years of their growing up that passed while I was managing other things. David was 17 before I really noticed that he had become a person with his own opinions and his own sense of humor and his own way of looking at the world that was distinct from mine. 17. And I had missed most of the construction of that person because I had been somewhere else in my head for the better part of a decade. That one takes some sitting with, it really does. Carol carries her own version of this story, and I am not the right person to tell it because it's hers, but I am aware of it. I'm aware of the years she spent managing the house and the kids largely on her own while I was at the plant, or traveling, or bringing work home in my head. I'm aware of the social life she put on hold because our schedules never quite aligned, and I was always tired and it was easier to just stay in. I'm aware that she built her independence out of necessity as much as personality, that she learned not to need me for things she had originally assumed we would share because waiting for me had too often meant the thing not happening at all. We have a good marriage. We genuinely do. We like each other. We have history and comfort and a shared language built over 40 years of living side by side. But I look at her sometimes now and I wonder what it would have been like if I had been more present through those middle years, if I had guarded our time together the way I guarded my work commitments. If I had put Carol on my calendar the way I put vendor meetings on my calendar, which sounds ridiculous and also sounds exactly right, and I'm not sure which of those is more telling. There are other smaller regrets scattered through the years that I won't catalog in full because they would take all day and most of them would sound familiar to anyone listening to this who has lived a similar kind of life. The friendships I let lapse because I was too busy to maintain them. The hobbies I dropped one by one as the years got fuller and the energy got shorter. The trip to Ireland that my father always talked about wanting to take and that we kept meaning to plan, and then he got sick and we never went, and now he's been gone for 12 years and the trip is a thing that simply didn't happen and cannot happen. These are not catastrophes. I want to be careful not to make them sound like catastrophes. They are the ordinary accumulation of a busy life. The inevitable costs of choosing one thing over another, across thousands of small daily decisions made under the genuine pressure of real responsibilities. But they are also losses, real ones, and retirement is when they come to sit with you, because retirement is when you finally have enough stillness and enough silence for them to make themselves heard. Somewhere around the 8-month mark, I decided I had spent enough time sitting with the weight of everything, and that I needed to actually do something about it. Not in a dramatic way. I wasn't the kind of man who's going to sign up for a vision quest or start journaling my feelings or any of that. I just knew that the way things had been going wasn't sustainable, and that I needed to find something to attach my days to that felt real and meaningful in at least some small measure. So I started trying things. That's the most honest way I can put it. I started trying things the way you try different keys on a ring when you can't remember which one opens the lock. Some of them fit a little. Most of them didn't fit at all. The woodworking was the first thing I returned to with genuine intention. I went to the hardware store and bought some proper lumber and a few new tools I had been meaning to get for years, and I came home and I cleaned up the workbench in the garage properly for the first time since I'd set it up, and I started working on a small bookshelf. Nothing complicated. Just a straightforward 4-shelf unit that I was going to give to David for his home office. And I want to tell you that the first few sessions out in that garage were genuinely good in a way that surprised me. There was something about the physical work of it, the measuring and the cutting and the fitting and the sanding that occupied my hands and a certain portion of my mind in a way that felt clean and uncomplicated. When I was out there working on that shelf, I wasn't thinking about what I was supposed to be doing with my life, or whether I was relevant or what time it was. I was just working, and that felt good. That felt like something I recognized. The problem was that it only worked when I was actively in the middle of it. The moment I put the tools down and came back inside the house, the good feeling evaporated pretty quickly, and I was back in the same shapeless afternoon I had left. It was like the woodworking was a window I could climb through for a few hours, but it wasn't a room I could actually live in. I needed something with more sustained engagement, something that put me in contact with other people on a regular basis, something that created a kind of structure and expectation that I could organize my days around the way my work schedule had once organized them. I tried a gym. I joined the YMCA about a mile from the house, which I'd driven past probably 1,000 times over the years without ever going inside. I started going 3 mornings a week, using the treadmill and some of the weight machines. It was fine. The place was mostly populated in the mornings by other retired people, older men and women moving at a deliberate pace and a handful of younger people who clearly had flexible work schedules. Nobody talked much. You put your headphones in and you did your thing and you left. It was better than staying home, but it wasn't a community in any real sense. I didn't make a single friend at that gym in the 4 months I went there, which tells you something either about me or about gyms or about both. I tried volunteering. Carol had mentioned it a few times and I had sort of nodded along without really committing to the idea, but eventually I called the local food bank and signed up to help with their weekly distribution. I went every Thursday morning for about 3 months, and I want to be fair to it because there was real value in it. The work was straightforward, sorting and packing and handing out boxes, and the people who ran it were genuinely good people doing genuinely important work. I respected it. But I am going to be honest with you in a way that I feel a little ashamed to admit even now, which is that it didn't fill the specific hole I was trying to fill. The hole I was trying to fill wasn't just about being useful in a general sense, it was about being useful in a way that drew on who I specifically was, on the particular accumulation of knowledge and experience and capability that I had spent 40 years building. Packing boxes of canned goods was good and necessary work, and I'm glad it happens in the world. But it didn't require anything from me specifically. Anyone with a working set of hands could do what I was doing on those Thursday mornings, which is true and important, and also, in the emotional landscape of what I was dealing with, not quite enough. I don't say that to diminish the work or the people. I say it only because it's honest. Around month 10, I heard through a neighbor about a mentorship program that a local community college ran, pairing retired professionals with students in related fields who were trying to figure out career paths. I went to an information session and I signed up. And this one, I have to tell you, this one was different. They matched me with a young man named Carlos, 22 years old, studying industrial technology, the first in his family to go to college, serious and quiet, and hungry to learn in a way that reminded me of myself at that age in ways that were both obvious and a little painful. We met every other week at a coffee shop near the campus, and I would talk to him about the industry, about how manufacturing operations actually worked from the inside, about what skills mattered and what didn't, and how to navigate a workplace and how to talk to people above you and below you and alongside you. And something happened in those conversations that I hadn't felt in almost a year. I felt like I knew things that were worth knowing. I felt like the specific contents of my specific mind and my specific experience had value to someone who needed exactly that, and not something else. I felt useful in the particular way that I had been useful for 40 years, the way that was tied to who I specifically was and what I specifically knew. Those meetings with Carlos became the fixed point of my weeks for a good stretch of time. I'd think about what I wanted to cover with him. I'd remember things from my career that were relevant to something he'd mentioned, and I'd make a note to bring it up next time. I'd go home after our sessions feeling lighter than I had felt in months. It wasn't a cure for everything I had been dealing with. It wasn't a replacement for a career or a full identity or a daily sense of purpose, but it was real. It was something genuinely real in a period when real things had been in short supply. Carol noticed the difference. She didn't make a big deal of it, which was very much her style, but she mentioned one evening that I seemed more like myself lately, and I think we both understood what she meant by that, even though neither of us unpacked it further. I kept going to the food bank on Thursdays too, and I kept working in the garage on projects. The bookshelf got finished, and David genuinely liked it, and I started a small side table after that. None of it added up to a full life the way my working years had been a full life. But it was beginning to add up to something, and something, I was slowly learning, was not nothing. I don't think acceptance arrived for me the way it does in stories, where there's a clear moment of clarity and everything shifts and you can point to the exact day things changed. It was slower than that, and less definitive than that, and honestly more believable for being those things. It came in pieces, the way light comes into a room in the morning, not all at once, but gradually, 1 degree at a time, until at some point you realize the room is bright, and you couldn't have told you exactly when that happened. The first piece came from an unexpected place. I was sitting with Carlos at the coffee shop one afternoon, about 14 months into my retirement, and he said something that stopped me mid-sentence. We'd been talking about a problem he was having, navigating a difficult personality in one of his internship placements, a supervisor who was territorial and dismissive of younger workers, and I had been walking him through how I would approach that kind of situation, drawing on specific examples from my own career. And Carlos looked at me across the table with a very direct expression and said, "I don't think I would have figured any of this out without you." Not like flattery, not the way a kid says something nice to seem appreciative. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you state something you have simply observed to be true. And I sat with that for a moment, and something in me that had been clenched for a long time released a little, not all the way, but a little. I drove home from that coffee shop and I thought about what he had said, and I thought about the fact that the knowledge I carried, the knowledge I had been quietly grieving as irrelevant and outdated since I left the plant, was sitting across a table from a 22-year-old kid, and it was genuinely helping him build something. It wasn't going to waste. It was still in circulation in the world, just through a different channel than I had spent 40 years using. That thought settled something in me that I hadn't been able to settle on my own. The second piece came from Carol, on a Sunday morning about a month after that. We were sitting on the back porch with our coffee, something we had started doing together on Sunday mornings, which was one of the genuinely good things that retirement had given us, this unhurried hour on the back porch before the day started doing anything. And she said, out of nowhere, the way she sometimes does, "You know you're different than you were a year ago?" I asked her what she meant, and she said she meant that I was more here, more present. And she wasn't saying it as a compliment exactly. She was saying it as an observation, but it landed as something more than that, because I knew what she was referring to, and I knew she was right. The constant background hum of work that had occupied some portion of my mind every day for 40 years was gone, and in its absence, something had gradually come forward that I think had been there all along, but had never had room to fully surface. I was paying attention to things I'd never paid attention to before. The specific quality of light on a late afternoon in October. The way the neighborhood sounded on a Sunday morning, which was different from how it sounded on a weekday morning and different again from a Saturday. And I had never noticed those distinctions before because I had never been still enough to notice them. Small things, but they were mine in a way that felt new and honest. I started understanding, slowly and without fanfare, that identity doesn't have to be a single fixed thing that you either have or you don't. I had spent the first year of retirement feeling like I had lost my identity, as though it were a coat I had left somewhere and couldn't find. But what I was beginning to understand was that the coat I had been wearing for 40 years was not the only coat I owned. It was just the one I had worn every single day for so long that I had forgotten I had others. I was a husband in a way I hadn't fully inhabited before. I was a grandfather in a way I was just beginning to explore. I was a man with knowledge worth sharing, and hands that could make things, and a mind that still worked well when I gave it something real to work on. None of that was nothing. None of that was the absence I had been mourning. It was just different, and different, I was learning at 68 years old, was not the same as less. I want to talk to you directly for a few minutes. Not as someone who has figured everything out, because I haven't, and I'd be suspicious of anyone who told you they had. But as someone who has been through enough of this particular experience now to have a few thoughts that I wish someone had shared with me before I walked out of that plant for the last time with a card full of signatures and a sheet cake from the grocery store and a head full of expectations that didn't quite match what was waiting for me. The first thing I want to say is that if you are somewhere in the years approaching retirement, or if you are already in the early stretch of it and you're feeling things that you don't quite have words for yet, things like a quiet disorientation, or a low-grade emptiness, or a sense of being slightly out of step with the world you are now living in, I want you to know that what you are feeling is real, and it is legitimate, and it does not mean something is wrong with you. It means you're a person who spent a long time being deeply embedded in a structure that gave your days shape and your identity definition, and now that structure is gone, and your mind and your sense of self are doing the slow and genuinely difficult work of reorganizing around a new reality. That is hard work. It deserves to be acknowledged as hard work rather than dismissed with the observation that you should just be grateful because you earned this. Gratitude and difficulty are not mutually exclusive. You can be grateful for what you have and still find the transition genuinely hard. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and usually are. The second thing I want to say is about identity, because I think this is where a lot of men my age get caught without realizing it until they're already deep in the middle of it. We build our sense of who we are around what we do for so long that we stop being able to see the difference between the two. The job is not you. I know that sounds simple. I know you have probably heard some version of that before. But there is a significant difference between knowing something intellectually and actually feeling it to be true in the lived experience of your daily life. The knowing comes easily. The feeling takes much longer and requires the kind of patience sitting with discomfort that most of us were never taught and were actively discouraged from doing by the culture we grew up in. Give yourself the time to feel it through. Don't rush the process, because the process is the thing. The third thing is about relationships, and I say this as a man who learned it later than I should have. The people in your life, your spouse, your children, your old friends, they are not supporting characters in the story of your career. They are the story. I spent 40 years treating them, not intentionally and not unkindly, but treating them as the context within which my work life happened, rather than understanding that my work was supposed to be the context within which my real life happened. That is a meaningful inversion, and if you catch it early enough, you can do something about it. If you catch it late, as I did, you can still do something about it, just with less runway. Either way, do something about it. The fourth thing I want to say is to not underestimate what you know. The knowledge and experience you have accumulated over a working life of 30 or 40 years does not expire when your career ends. It is still in you. It is still real, and it is still valuable. And there are people in the world, younger people building their own working lives, who need exactly what you have. Find ways to put it back into circulation. Mentoring, advising, teaching, consulting in whatever informal capacity makes sense for your situation. Not because you need to stay busy, though staying meaningfully engaged does matter, but because the knowledge genuinely has value, and passing it forward is one of the most satisfying things you can do with the years you have left. The last thing is the simplest and also, in some ways, the hardest. Be honest with yourself and with the people close to you about what you are actually experiencing. Not performing fine when you are not fine. Not telling your spouse you're just tired when what you mean is that you are lonely and disoriented and scared in a way you don't know how to articulate. The men of my generation were not raised to talk about those things, and I understand that, and I am not criticizing anyone for it, because I lived it myself for a very long time. But the silence costs you. It costs you, and it costs the people who love you and who are trying to understand what is happening with you and who can only work with what you give them. Give them something real. It doesn't have to be a long conversation. It doesn't have to be perfectly articulated. It just has to be honest. That's enough. That's more than enough, actually. I'm sitting on the back porch as I tell you all of this. It's a Tuesday morning in early spring, and the air has that particular quality it gets in April, when the cold hasn't fully let go yet, but the warmth is clearly coming. You can feel it underneath the chill, like a promise the day is working up to keeping. The oak tree in the yard has just started to bud, those small tight buds that look almost tentative, like they're not quite sure yet if it's safe to open up all the way. Carol is inside. I can hear her moving around in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of her morning, the cabinet opening, the drawer closing, the quiet domestic music of a life shared for a very long time with another person. I have my coffee. It's the right temperature this morning, which sounds like a small thing and is a small thing and is also, I have come to understand, not nothing. There was a time, not so long ago really in the grand accounting of a life, when I would have walked past this porch without sitting on it. When I would have been out the door and in the car and on the highway before the oak tree had a chance to register in my peripheral vision. I lived at a speed for a very long time that made most of the quiet, beautiful things invisible, not because they weren't there, but because I was always moving too fast to see them. I don't say that as a regret exactly. Not anymore. I say it as an observation. That speed was what the life required, and I met the requirement, and I am not sorry I did. But I am glad, genuinely and quietly glad, that I am no longer required to move at that speed. Because from here, from this chair on this porch at this particular pace, the world has a texture and a richness that I simply could not access before. I think about my father sometimes on mornings like this. He worked hard his whole life too, harder than me in many ways. Physical labor that wore on his body in ways that office work and plant management never wore on mine. He retired at 62 and he died at 73. And I don't know how much of those 11 years he spent at peace with who he was outside of work, because we never talked about it. Men of his generation talked about those things even less than men of mine. I wish we had talked about it. I wish I had asked him what it felt like to stop, what it felt like to have the days open up the way they do, what he found on the other side of all that work. I think he would have had things worth saying. I'm 68 now. And if the math runs the same way for me as it did for him, I have a handful of years left that could be a handful or could be more, and I have stopped trying to calculate it with any precision, because that calculation doesn't serve me. What serves me is this morning and this coffee and the sound of Carol in the kitchen and the oak tree doing its patient seasonal work, and the knowledge that later today I am going to meet Carlos for coffee, and I am going to hear about how the internship is going, and I am going to have something useful to say. What serves me is the small table I am building in the garage, slowly, without any deadline, just for the pleasure of making something solid and real with my own two hands. What serves me is Sunday mornings on the same porch with Carol and the unhurried hour that has become, without either of us formally deciding it, one of the best parts of my week. I am not the man I was at 45, striding through a plant with a clipboard and a full head of steam and a clear sense of exactly what needed to happen next. I am not going to be that man again, and I have made a kind of peace with that which I think is real, and not just something I am telling myself. The man I am now moves more slowly and notices more and carries the weight of more years and more reflection and more honest reckoning with what a life actually is when you strip away the productivity and the title and the busyness and look at what's underneath. What's underneath, I have found, is enough. It is genuinely enough. Not a consolation prize, not a lesser version of something better. Just enough, in the way that a quiet morning with good coffee and the sound of someone you love moving around inside your house is enough, fully, honestly, sufficiently enough. If you have stayed with me through all of this, through the quiet mornings and the long nights and the slow and imperfect working through of everything I have shared with you today, then I suspect some part of this story felt familiar to you. Maybe you are already in retirement and you recognize something in what I described, that particular silence, that particular shapelessness, that particular question of who you are when the work is finally done. Or maybe you are still working, still in the middle of it, and something in what I said about presence in time and the people we love landed somewhere specific inside you. Or maybe you are somewhere in between, close enough to the end of your working years that you are starting to think about what comes next in a more serious way than you used to. Wherever you are, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to sit with it honestly rather than answering it too quickly. The question is simply this. When you take away the title and the schedule and the obligations and all the external things that tell you who you are and what you are for, what is left? Not as a frightening question, as a genuine and important one, because whatever is left, whatever you find when you get quiet enough and still enough to actually look, that is the thing worth knowing. That is the part of you that was there before the career started, and that will still be there when it ends, and it deserves your attention and your honesty, and probably a good deal more of your time than you have given it so far. I spent too long being afraid of that question. I am asking you to be a little less afraid of it than I was. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you something to think about or helped you feel a little less alone in what you are going through or going toward, it would mean a great deal to me if you would subscribe to this channel. There are more stories here, more honest conversations about this season of life that not enough people are having out loud. You don't have to face any of this alone, and I am glad you were here today. I genuinely am.